It's my great pleasure to welcome Alisha Rankin to the Early Science Workshop. She has written and continues to write on the history of science and medicine and pharmacy in particular, as well as women's history and the intersection of expert and lay knowledge and the history of experimental practices. She is the author of Panacea's Daughters, Noble Women as Healers in Early Modern Germany, that came out in 2013 and won the prestigious Gerald Strauss Prize for Reformation History. She is the co-editor of a volume called Secrets and Knowledge in Medicine and Science, 1500 to 1800, as well as a 2017 theme issue of the Bulletin of the History of Medicine on testing drugs and trying cures. And she is co-editing the, I guess, in progress volume on early modern medicine in the Cambridge History of Medicine.
Yeah, it's just getting going. Yeah, so very much.
And she's going to speak today about her more or less brand new book. I think the official date of publication was just this past January, which may or may not have coincided when it actually took physical form, as these things go. The Poison Trials, Wonder Drugs, Experiment, and the Battle for Authority in Renaissance Science. So you're already interested since you're here, and we'll be hearing lots about it, but I'll just also point you, besides, I just assume if you haven't already done so, you will immediately order a copy as soon as the talk's over. You can also read an excerpt that was on the Lapham's Quarterly website, and apparently you're working on a maybe continuing this theme with a kind of looking at the longer term of the history of using prisoners in medical experiments. So I'm even more excited that there might be more of this to come. So without further ado, I'm going to put the spotlight here on Alisha and turn it over to her. So she's going to speak for some more or less normal amount of time, and then we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion.
All right, thanks so much. And I'm very sorry that I can't be in Davis to, be with you all, but I do like that I get to have people here who couldn't come otherwise. Okay, so this is just an overview of my book. I want to kind of give you a general overview, and then I'm going to dive into one of the chapters, but I'm happy to answer questions on any and all aspects at the end. But go ahead, sorry.
I just interrupt, Alisha. You're sharing your presenter notes if you don't want
to. I am, okay, excuse me.
I mean, it's not so terrible, but just...
No, that was a mistake.
Know before you go on.
I did the wrong thing. Hold on, I'm going to redo the share. Hold on. Oh, now my entire screen. Okay. So I'm gonna redo the screen share so that I'm not doing that. Okay. I thought it looked weird. Okay. Okay. All right. Is that better? Can you see only my talk now?
Yes, that's good. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you so much. So as you saw, if you read my presenter notes, the book describes tests of poison antidotes, especially tests conducted on condemned criminals and animals, in which the test subject would be given poison to see if the antidote worked. So this kind of test became relatively common at princely courts in the 16th century. And I use them as a window, kind of an entry point into developing ideas about medical experiment and proof in the century before the big experimental boom that came to be known as the scientific revolution. But before I give this overview of the topic, I want to explain how I came to write about this topic, which is through my first book, which some of you know, focusing on women healers in early modern Germany. And I traveled to various archives to look at letters and medical recipe books. And one of these archives was this tiny archive in southwestern Germany in the little town called Neuenstein, which only has about 6,000 residents. And the archive itself is in the castle. So there's like a hotel and a bakery and then a Renaissance castle in this town and a few houses, and that's about it. But the archive's in the castle. And so there's this little sign here that up this like windy staircase that says to the archive. So when I was there looking at women's recipe books, the archivist came to me out of the blue and said, well, if you're interested in 16th century medicine, you might want to take a look at this file, which was he described as a strange case in which a condemned criminal was used to test an antidote to poison. So I took a look at the file and instantly was like, wow, this is great. This will be a chapter of this book I was planning to write on German pharmacy. And on a related note, when I went back to this archive in 2018 to catch up on some loose ends there. And they were super helpful and gave me the German tradition of Kaffee and Kuchen, coffee and cake. And so the moral of that story is that working at tiny out of the way archives is the best thing. Anyway, so I was originally going to use this this idea of testing an antidote and a poison and an antidote on a condemned criminal as just a small part of a larger book on pharmacy. But talking to a few colleagues, particularly Katie Park and Bruce Moran, they were like, oh, I've heard of that. That I saw another case in which that happened. So they pointed me to various places. And eventually I realized that this phenomenon of what I came to call a poison trial was not an isolated case, that using condemned criminals to test poison was widespread at princely courts in the 16th century. So this required me to brush up on various rusty language skills, especially Italian, Latin, and French, all of which I had taken before but hadn't used in a while. I spent a day trying to teach myself Czech to read a Czech herbal. And I also ended up, instead of studying women who were outside of the medical mainstream, which had been the whole point of my first book, I found myself studying male physicians, princes, and popes, which caused a great deal of whiplash and a bit of an identity crisis. But the material was completely fascinating. So I'm going to take you to the start of my book, which is Rome, 1524, in mid-August. And I'm going to tell you a little story, which is the opening anecdote of the book. So in the heat of a Roman August in 1524, an agent called Labatino wrote to his patron, Federico II Gonzaga of Mantua, with a bold pronouncement. When he returned home to Mantua, he would bring the prince the most precious thing one could have in the world. This marvelous item was not a rare gem, nor a precious metal, nor a weapon of war, but instead a medicinal oil that had been proven to work against all poison. The antidote had been created by a former friar and a surgeon named Gregorio Caravita, who offered it to Pope Clement VII with the assurance that it would cure any poison taken into the body. So you might expect that Pope Clement VII might say thanks but no thanks and send Caravita away, but far from ignoring Caravita's claims, he agreed to have the oil tested. And he commanded his medical personnel to try it on 2 condemned criminals who had been condemned to be beheaded. Led by the Pope's personal physician, Paolo Giovio, the doctors gave both prisoners a good quantity of a deadly aconite called Nepellus. And it was described, the agent writing the letter described it as enough to kill not merely 2 men, but 100. As the poison took effect, the prisoners started to gesticulate wildly, cry out from the pain in their hearts, and immediately Caravita anointed one of them with some of the oil, and the man's heart and pulse returned to normal. The other prisoner, who was given no antidote, died in great agony. A second test of the oil on a Mantuan criminal poisoned with arsenic yielded similar results. Labatino boasted that Giovio had promised him a sample of the antidote to bring back to Mantua, and he also noted that Caravita knew how to make the oil and might be willing to pass on the knowledge for a price. So word of this event quickly spread. Less than 2 weeks after this letter was written, a 4-page pamphlet appeared in print, described as a testimony of the most true and admirable virtues of a composite oil against plague and all poison, which on the command of the Supreme Pontiff Clement VII, an experiment was conducted by distinguished men in the Roman Capitoline building. So it was written in Latin, and it was addressed to all good mortals and signed by the physician Jovio, the papal pharmacist Tommaso Bigliotti, and the Roman senator Pietro Borghese. And it emphasized that Pope Clement VII himself had ordered its publication. So we learn a little bit more from this pamphlet than we do from the letter. We learn that the test subjects involved 2 Corsicans named Gianfrancesco and Ambrogio, and who have been convicted of unnamed violent crimes. The medics gave them marzipan cakes poisoned with aconite, and then Gianfrancesco was the one who was given the antidote, and Ambrogio was given no antidote because he was described as the more savage of the 2. And poor Ambrogio suffered for 4 hours before he died. Gianfrancesco, after his impressive survival, was sent to the slave galleys instead of being executed, which was intended as a reward. The testers then wished to see if the antidote also worked against different poisons. So they ordered a test on another criminal using arsenic, and it happened to be a Mantuan man who was convicted of murder. And he drank a swill of raw eggs mixed with sugar and arsenic. This time, Jovio, Bigliotti, and Borghese described this as they wrote this in the sort of first person we. This is what we did. They said they administered the poison and the antidote with their own hands to make sure that Caravita was not tricking them. And this test was also successful, and like Gianfrancesco, Antonio was sent off to the slave galleys. The pontiff then granted Caravita a substantial sum of money as a reward. So these 2 accounts together leave little doubt that in 1524, Pope Clement VII and his personal physician devised a test using deadly poison on human beings to see if they could be cured. So the event appears to have all the quintessential elements of the darker side of Renaissance Italy: poisoned, violent prisoners, cruel popes, greedy princes, and Mantuan spies. We might be tempted to call it the case of the poisoned marzipan and relegate it to the files of historical oddities, as some historians have already done. Yet the test of Caravita's oil had a significance that went far beyond Pope Clement's fear of poison and his power over those condemned to die. It provides very early evidence of contrived experiments conducted on human test subjects by respected medical professionals. Jovio, Bigliotti, and Borghese not only signed the public pamphlet announcing the success, they also specifically claimed the report was true and presented it as a significant and valid medical finding. The test was also witnessed by an ambitious young physician, Pietro Andrea Mattioli, who ended up being one of the most central figures in my book, which was a surprise to me. But Mattioli was a student of Caravita's at the time, and 2 decades after this test, he included a description of this poison trial in his commentaries on Dioscorides, which became one of the most influential medical books of the 16th century. It was published initially in Italian, but translated into Latin in 1554, and then all kinds of European languages after that. And Mattioli constantly updated this book throughout his life. In the very first edition, in his section on aconites, Mattioli used the trial of Caravita's oil as evidence of the toxicity of aconitum napellus, this particular aconite. And so he said he was present at the trial of Caravita's oil, and he gave a short description that pretty much echoed the previous 2 versions that I described to you. So the appearance of this test in the work of the respected Mattioli spread word of Clement VII's antidote test far and wide, and it reinforced its medical legitimacy, especially after the Latin translation in 1554. By 1540, even before this sort of more widespread dissemination had happened, there had been a few copycat trials of oils like Caravita's oils done by prelates of the church, so 2 different cardinals in different cities in Italy, both of which failed. But then after that, after Mattioli published this work, they really took off. So between 1524 and 1600, over a dozen documented poison trials on condemned criminals took place in Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, and there were allusions to many others. These tests on condemned criminals always took place on the command of a powerful prince, pope, or cardinal, and they were all conducted by prominent physicians or surgeons. So my book tells the story of these trials, and it focuses on these antidote tests both as a mirror of Renaissance medical practice, but also as an important crucible for ideas about evidence, authority, and proof. So I look not just at this kind of contrived trial on human test subjects in its own of itself, those are the first few chapters, but also in instances in which these kinds of tests were not used and not viewed as appropriate. So kind of the presence and absence. So I have three main arguments that I'll take you through. First, in developing and carrying out poison trials, the testers devoted careful attention to method and wrote detailed experimental reports. And this is significant because they provide rare examples of contrived trials to test drugs, what we might now call an experiment. And at the time, experiment was one of the many terms used. As anyone attending early modern working group probably knows, experiment was not a precise term in the 16th century. And actually, the terms used to describe this kind of test ranged from experiment to experience to trial to proof. Those were the four that were used most commonly in a variety of different languages. But in any case, these were trials that were set up and contrived deliberately. And I argue that this generated extensive engagement with experimental thinking. And I use that term experimental thinking to indicate this kind of engagement that's sort of moving towards more consolidated idea of what became the experiment in the 17th century. And this was really important because in general, it was very difficult to test drugs through contrived experiments. So as most of you know, the predominant medical theory was the Galenic four humors, which meant that each person had an individual balance of humors. And that meant that different drugs would act differently in different people. So there was no real way to test drugs. What you could test was the property of different substances. So you knew where they fit in the Galenic theory, and you knew how to fit them into the system to use them on individual patients. So that meant that drugs were usually tested, if at all, by observation on ill patients. And it was done in a fairly descriptive system of case studies. And then there's been a lot of work, obviously, in case studies in the 16th century, particularly by Gianno Pomata. And so this is kind of the standard way to test drugs. But poison was an exception in how it worked because it could work very differently than other kinds of ailments. So poison could throw your humors out of whack really dramatically. So that's one way it could operate. But there was another kind of occult theory of the operation of poison that circumvented the Galenic humoral system, in which the whole substance of the poison would affect the whole substance of the body. And this theory was called total substance or specific form. And Frederick Gibbs just published a couple years ago a book on poison and medicine in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. And he really describes this theory in great detail. This is kind of the whole focus of his book, really. But it explained this idea, explained why a small amount of poison could affect the body so significantly, and why it affected people of different humoral complexions the same way. It also, however, meant that poison was easier to test because it would affect all bodies similarly, and hence that also antidotes to poison were easier to test because they similarly would affect bodies similarly. So poison had long been viewed as particularly testable because the subject either got sick and died, or it lived. So testing of poison antidotes on condemned criminals, we have evidence of this from antiquity, most directly from King Mithridates VI Eupator of Pontus, who was described in various sources, including Galen, as using antidotes, using condemned criminals to test antidotes to poison. And Mattioli, in his writings, made note of this. By the time of Galen, it had become taboo to use human subjects to test poison, or at least that's what Galen writes. So he says, I can't use poison to test antidotes, so instead I will use roosters. And he was writing about this in particular regards to the antidote theriac, which was both a poison antidote and a cure-all, which, as we'll see, was very common. And he promoted in many of his works theriac as a marvelous cure. This particular work on theriac to Pisa was attributed to Galen. There's been a lot of dispute about whether it's authentic or not. The most recent thought is that it was not, but that doesn't really matter to this conversation because everyone in the Renaissance was pretty sure this was a Galenic work. And it sort of the influence of this was assumed to be Galenic. So he wrote that they take roosters, put poisonous beasts among them, and the roosters who had drunk theriac would survive, and those who had not drunk it would die immediately. And you find versions of this specific test using roosters or sometimes pheasants or other birds in a variety of Arabic medical sources based on Galen, and usually quoting Galen specifically. And then back in the Latin Middle Ages, as Arabic sources were filtering into the Middle Ages, you find this test taken up as well. So this sort of idea of that Galen tested poison on roosters was something that kind of went through the Middle Ages. And so Mattioli also made note of this as well, that he noted that physicians of ancient Rome made trials of the antidote theriac in the matter of Galen writing to Piso, and through these trials, they came up with the perfect mixture. So he's actually describing these tests as something that helped them create these drugs, which is actually not at all what Galen, the pseudo-Galen, wrote, but that's a whole other side story. In any case, the physicians serving at princely courts in the Renaissance reintroduced the use of condemned criminals for testing antidotes. So I have found no evidence in either the Islamic Empire or the Latin Middle Ages of any tests on humans of this kind. There's other kinds of, a couple of examples of testing poison in the courts of law. If there's a substance thought to be poison, it's often given to the suspected poisoner, but that's a whole side thing. That's a different thing. You're trying to test the poison, not trying to test the antidote. So in this case, these cases of condemned criminals being used to test antidotes, the case of Pope Clement VII is the first one that I have found. So I'm arguing that 16th century physicians used the idea of poison as particularly testable to conduct contrived trials, what we would now call experiments on human subjects. And there's often a discussion in them about humans being more valuable to test because testing it on animals wouldn't give you as much of a clear result as testing it on humans. So there's interesting ideas about the transferability between drugs on humans and animals. My second argument is that doctors were not doing these kinds of tests in a scholarly vacuum. They were well aware of a different kind of poison trial already gaining steam in Renaissance Europe, which were vibrant marketplace shows by mountebanks, charlatans, other empirical practitioners who sold antidotes and cure-alls through dramatic displays of self-poisoning or poison demonstrations on animals. So we have lots of descriptions of these from both Italy and Germany. There are some in France as well. Mattioli spent pages railing against these texts, calling the charlatans who did them deceiving deceivers who deceive, basically lying liars who lie, and using all kinds of tricks to hoodwink innocent commoners. He goes into detail about exactly how they're hoodwinking people. And so physicians, I argue, portrayed their poison trials as learned experiments as an explicit contrast to these marketplace shows. So they did this by writing out very detailed experimental reports that really followed the Galenic idea. So you can see these really scholarly ideas in the descriptions of all of these poison trials that have, not all of them have long descriptions, but those that do and are written by physicians or learned surgeons, it's extremely galenic, and I'm arguing deliberately so. At the same time, physicians could never escape the marketplace. So at the same time that they're trying to distance themselves from the market, they're also really kind of attracted to these ideas of new drugs, of that some of these charlatans drugs might actually have something to them. So remember that Jovio, this trial of Caravita's oil was a drug hawked by an empiric. It was not by a learned physician. And Mattioli, for his part, had his own cures that might to our eyes sound somewhat dubious. So in his page, so after his long criticism of empirics, he introduced his own marvelous cure, which he called his scorpion oil, and explained how this was actually a new drug that was worthy of consideration. And he claimed this was so because it had been tested in a poison trial. And he actually said that this was a version of Caravita's oil. And Mattioli wasn't alone in his kind of push and pull with the marketplace. Many physicians eagerly sought and sometimes even advertised new wonder drugs with claims of success that to our ears sound far-fetched. So my book's trying to blur the lines that these scholarly physicians tried and failed to draw around their practice. And then my third argument is that these experiments on human subjects had to take into account the limitations of using humans for deadly tests, a kind of early medical ethics centered on cultural and religious norms. So previous historical scholarship has given little attention to humans as experimental subjects before the 18th century. But there's been a lot of literature on the use of cadavers for anatomical investigation. And it's well known that this convention faced a lot of resistance from local populaces. So I argue that using living criminals to test poison was even more complicated than using dead criminals for a dissection, and that testers had to use a variety of devices to make the practice acceptable. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the chapter that really delves into this issue at the end of this talk. But these strategies focused on procedure rather than human rights, and there was little concern with the exploitation of human bodies for experimental purposes or with the gruesome effects of the test itself. None of those are a problem at all. It's about the proper procedure, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. But nevertheless, the testers devoted surprising attention to narratives surrounding human experimentation. So you may be wondering why poison was such a matter of concern and investigation in the first place. So that's kind of central to the book. There's two main reasons why poison really became this node around which all of this rotated. The first were concerns about malicious poisoning, which was always a concern, especially at princely courts, but especially in the Renaissance, kind of as is fairly well known. But the other, and in some ways the more important one, was poison was seen as an underlying cause of epidemic diseases, and especially plague. So ever since the first plague epidemic in the Middle Ages, plague and poison have been closely tied together. And cures for poison could be viewed as cures for illness more broadly. Caravita first came to Pope Clement's attention because he claimed to have successfully cured many plague patients. And there was a long tradition of poison antidotes being useful for disease more broadly. So I mentioned already the ancient antidote theriac, but there are also animal products like bezoar stone, which if you've read Harry Potter, is the calcified deposits that are found in the stomachs of certain animals. They were especially prized from Persian mountain goats, and were eventually also found in Peruvian animals, animals in the Andes by the Spanish. Unicorn horn, which is obviously not a real thing, but they use either narwhal tusk or rhinoceros horn. Usually various different horns came into the European marketplace as unicorn horn. With the Spanish colonization of the Americas, hundreds of potentially useful drugs poured into Europe, including a version of bezoarstone, but also a variety of herbs and other animal products, which led to an unprecedented collaboration between physicians and merchants. Some of these new drugs were specific remedies for specific diseases or specific purposes, but others were touted as near panaceas that could cure poison, among other things. So the most famous example of one of these drugs from the Spanish colonies is tobacco, which was described as a panacea herb in a Dutch publication from 1587, but contained anti-poison properties among its many virtues. So there's a long list of virtues, and curing poison, especially poisonous arrows, is one of them. New cure-alls that also could cure poison also emerged out of a separate tradition, the practice of alchemical medicine and distillation. And a flourishing interest in distillation led to a boom in new alchemical cures, many of which were viewed as near cure-alls or sometimes actual cure-alls, but many of which also were specifically said to cure poison. So a good example of that is actually Mattioli's scorpion oil was specifically a poison antidote that was alchemically produced, but could cure many other diseases as well. So there were a lot of new drugs, which also held the impetus towards testing. And many of these drugs were viewed as things that would work universally on all bodies. So the alchemical cures, like the antidotes to poison, were viewed as working universally on all bodies. So there was a lot of new drugs and new opportunities for testing going on throughout this time period. And the connection between poison antidotes and wonder drugs is really crucial to all of this, because poison antidotes are not just for poison, they're for a variety of things. And in the end of my book, I argue that the cure-all property actually starts to take over the specific interest in poison, and there is more of a trend towards wonder drugs in general rather than specifically poison antidotes. So my book traces the meaning of poison trials over the longue durée from ancient Greece into the 17th century, with the main focus on the 16th century. I take a pan-European approach, drawing on examples from around Europe and its colonies, but the bulk of evidence comes from Renaissance Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. Each chapter highlights an antidote that illustrates a chapter's theme. So I've broken the book into 3 sections. The first one, authorities, focuses on precedents for poison trials. Chapter 1, which is called Poison on Trial, looks at, so I've picked an antidote to go with every chapter. So chapter 1 examines the back history of poison trials in the ancient world, the Islamic Empire, and medieval Europe. And I argue that throughout this period, in a variety of different ways, poison was seen as a substance that lent itself especially well to testing. Chapter 2 examines how the background of anatomical dissection fed into the trial of Caravita's oil, and the way that trial engendered additional trials in Italy under Catholic authorities. The second part of the book on experiments looks at, chapter 3 looks at Mattioli's role in spreading poison trials around Europe, and really gets into this idea of poison trials as learned experiments. That chapter is also the one with the most gruesome anecdotes about poison trials. Chapter 4 examines that case I found in the archive in Neuenstein as a lens on the sort of early medical ethics, and that's the one I'll be talking about in a minute. And then my last chapter explains this sort of sliding between poison antidotes and wonder drugs. Chapter 5 examines poison antidotes as valuable commodities that were part of the drug trade. And so I discuss both the princely treasuries and Kunstkammer, or Chamber of Arts. And I argue that actually the status of some of these antidotes as treasures were just as important as items of display that they would put in their Kunstkammer. But I also describe the way that physicians who are not at courts and did not have access to condemned criminals to use for tests, the way that they used poison trials to test poison antidotes for authenticity. So quick and dirty, what I call marketplace tests, to show whether a given substance was what it said it was or not. And that gets into the real concerns about fraud in conjunction with some of these antidotes. And then finally, chapter 6 looks at one enterprising alchemist who confounded physicians with a poison antidote that he specifically called a panacea. And he specifically highlighted patient testimonial letters as a better proof of efficacy than poison trials. So that whole chapter revolves around ideas of proof and testing and who has the authority to say what kind of proof is valid. And really the whole book asks questions about what counted as proof of a cure, how physicians negotiated their own authority around that question, and how empirical practitioners were constantly throwing a wrench in their plans, and how they were constantly interested in what empirical practitioners were doing. Okay, so that's sort of a whirlwind tour through the book. Any of these topics that you're interested in hearing more about, I would love to talk about any of them, but I'm just going to give you, in my remaining like 7 minutes, a really brief overview of chapter 4, which partially because this is where my research began. It's the chapter that looks at the question of medical ethics, but also this was my favorite chapter because it really got into a case study of one specific case. And it focuses on a pattern I found in many of the poison trials, which was really surprising. So in most poison trials, condemned criminals were portrayed as giving their consent to taking the poison and then the antidote. Secondly, trials were presented as taking place for the public good, or often it's phrased as the good of all Christendom. And finally, the prisoner was usually either set free if he survived, or in some cases, like the 2 I mentioned at the beginning, the sentence was mitigated. So if they survived, they were not executed. Or I found one in which they were executed, but it was like they were given a more honorable execution. They were beheaded instead of being broken on the wheel, which was actually at the time a very big deal. And sometimes in the cases where they were set free, they even got money or clothing. So they were given a reward for taking part in these trials. And I thought that this was very interesting because the Nuremberg Code, compiled after World War II, listed these first 2 principles, the idea of consent and the idea of the public good, as that this was the first 2 items of the Nuremberg Code. And my 16th century poison trials took place a long time before any sort of medical ethics, before the word medical ethics even existed. And I think we can all agree that today they would be considered extremely unethical. So I found it really fascinating that this focus on consent and the public good was included there. So what's going on there, and why was there the reward of setting surviving prisoners free? What was going on with this? So to answer that question, I dug into this trial of a horse thief named Wendell Tumler. And so this case, and I did a real deep dive into the case study of him. So this case describes how in December of 1580, this man named Wendell Tumler stole a coin from another patron of a tavern in a small village near the town of Langenborg. He was caught red-handed, seized, marched down the river, and thrown into the dungeon of Langenborg Castle. This is the only part of the castle that still exists today, as it did in 1580, is in fact the door to the dungeon, and it's home to a bat colony today, so they can't open it. But apparently I was told that was the original door. And so he was questioned the next day and eventually initially confessed to just a few minor misdeeds, but eventually under torture, he confessed to 74 counts of thievery, mostly horse thefts. So you can see in the margins of this document here that there's some little notes, and those are actually notes made by notaries who went to try to verify these confessions. So they went to the people who he claimed he had stolen horses from and either wrote, "It's true, he did this," or he doesn't remember losing any horses, or he never owned any horses, so he couldn't have had any stolen from them. So many of them they actually thought were invalid, but there were enough that they were able to validate that they could condemn Wendell Tumler to death by hanging. But there was more to this case than met the eye. From the beginning of this case, the local prince, Count Wolfgang II of Hohenlohe, which if you're an early modernist and have worked at all at alchemy, you might recognize his name because he was quite well known for being an avid alchemical practitioner. And there's a couple of studies of his alchemy. But he had his eye on Tümler as a subject to test a poison antidote from the get-go. And there's a whole side story about Count Wolfgang really driving the use of torture and his counselors kind of pushing back against that. But in the end, once Tümler was convicted, his counselors were concerned about the possibility of doing this poison trial, especially his trusted advisor, Zacharias Huso. And thankfully for historians, Huso was not living in Langenburg, he was living in the town of Neuenstein. So there are letters back and forth between Wolfgang and Huso. And Huso worried that there would be unrest among the peasantry if Tümler was either seen to be coerced into the test, or if he took it, survived, and then the peasants were denied the spectacle of an execution and had to accept a thief back into their midst, so sort of unpunished thief back into their midst. So there is a back and forth between Huso and Wolfgang, and this back and forth gave me actual perspective on what might have been going on behind the scenes in some of these other poison trials. It demonstrated that the use of human bodies for poison testing was not as straightforward as it seemed. And I saw echoes of this in other sources, but this was the only place where it was discussed explicitly. So Huso and Wolfgang's other counselors came up with they put forth this text explaining exactly how things should proceed to make this test above board, so that there be no complications to do this test. And they called it a process and form, and how one should proceed with the giving of poison on the prisoner in Langenburg. And they sort of began by explaining why this was a desirable thing to do. They thought overall this was a good idea. But their sort of description of what should happen really read like directions for a play. This was a script of how everything should proceed. So they said first, they should let the criminal trial finish and have his death sentence pronounced. Then someone should a third party should go to Tümler and say that they had heard that Count Wolfgang had an antidote to poison that he wanted to test, and that Tümler should go to the legal authorities and offer himself as a test subject. And he should make it clear that he was doing this, quote, out of his own free will, without any tricks or force, also without being convinced or told to do it. And then Count Wolfgang, after hearing this, should at first appear reluctant and say, well, given the severity of his crimes, he was hesitant to grant this request. But then he should relent and agree to do it because the medicine would come to the comfort and rescue of many good, pious, God-fearing people. And this phrase, good, pious, God-fearing people, or some version of this is reiterated 3 different times. So this makes it really explicit that these 2 points are extremely important. But why? Why are these points why is it so important to emphasize these 2 things? So really quickly, I have 2 answers. The first one is that poison trials interrupted the ritual of execution. So execution was a really important cultural and religious ritual in early modern Europe, all areas, both Catholic and Protestant, in addition to being an instrument of justice. So it was supposed to do many different things at once. It was supposed to deter other criminals from doing crime, while also guiding the condemned person to a good death. In Catholic thought, the condemned could get time off purgatory, or sometimes even skip purgatory altogether if he was penitent and in the right way with God at the moment of execution. Protestants obviously believed that anyone could go to heaven if they truly believed in Jesus at the moment of execution, in his final moments. So for both of them, there is a real important religious dimension to the moment of execution. Also, from the point of view of the public, the execution punished a dangerous criminal and kept him out of society. So to interrupt that entire ritual was a really big deal, and it needed justification. And that, I should reiterate, is the reason that only these tests on human subjects only took place under princes, because they were the only people who had the power to give human bodies for this kind of experiment. The second reason is that a prince really did not want to be seen as a poisoner. Poison was viewed as a sneaky, scurrilous crime. Throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, princes were often accused each other of being poisoners as an insult. It was seen as a crime that was particularly scurrilous because it was hidden. Let's say you weren't showing yourself to your enemy, you were doing it secretively, and that was seen as a lower kind of crime. So unlike hand-to-hand combat, which was seen as more honorable, it was a really dishonorable form of crime. And a good example of this is this very famous fresco in Bad Government in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena by Ambrogio Lorenzati. And Bad Government is personified as a devil tyrant here in the middle, and he's holding a cup of poison. So the bad government is personified as a poisoner. So princes really don't want to be associated with being a poisoner, and that's why the public good is such an important thing to emphasize. So in the end, the solution to this whole problem was just following this proper procedure, making sure that the prisoner would give his consent, that the public good was emphasized again and again. So that kind of dissociated the prince from being a poisoner. And then this promise of freedom or mitigated punishment acknowledged the burden that the prisoner was taking upon himself. And in the case of Wendell Tumler, he did survive. He was set free, although he was banished from coming within 10 miles of Langenborg. In any case, I'm starting to go over time. So this is obviously not a kind of medical ethics based on human dignity, ideas of justice, but it was an attempt to negotiate the problem of using human bodies for medical research. And I found it very interesting that there even was this kind of negotiation. So that is just one chapter of my book. The other chapters are about very different topics, and I'm happy to talk about any of them. And thank you very much for listening. And there are my image credits. So I'm going to stop my share now and happy to answer any questions.
Do you just want to field your own questions and people can?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to.
The raised hand reaction or go like,
yeah, sure. Colin.
Thanks, Alisha. That was so fascinating. Really amazing material. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to dash to teach in about 5 minutes, but a question I had was, given all the concerns around fraud and charlatans, how did the community of learned physicians navigate ambiguous results in the poison trials? And was there concern around fraud among other learned physicians, and how did they deal with the inconclusive situations?
Yeah, so there weren't that many. So what they saw as inconclusive was usually if a prisoner died. For them, that was often seen as inconclusive. So remember, they're doing these for princes, so their motivation is to show that these are successful. So I have to say that from the get-go. We should not take these at face value as like anything they write. We should take with a strong grain of salt. But there were cases in which the prisoner died, but yet these extensive descriptions still appear. So Mattioli, for example, was testing an antidote that his patron, Archduke Ferdinand of Tyrol, had created. So this was actually a princely antidote, and the prisoner died in the end. And this is described in extensive detail. So I thought it was really interesting that this failed test by his patrons, testing his patron's antidote, was included in an updated version of his commentaries in extensive detail. But he blamed it on perhaps an old version of the, like an old, version of the antidote. And he also emphasized the toxicity of the poison. So often they pivot by emphasizing that these are really toxic substances, and obviously, the expected outcome is death, or that it doesn't work, so that it's kind of seen as a particular surprise if it does work. But in terms of, and then the other thing that they attempted to do is test one antidote against several different poisons. So that was, there's a couple of different cases. The carabitas oil is one of them, but there's a couple other cases in which one antidote in one court setting is tested against different poisons. I had to kind of piece those together from different sources because they're not laid out. Like this idea of repetition isn't necessarily something that the physicians themselves are really sort of describing at this point, but it's there if you kind of look at read different sources together, that they're clearly kind of doing this on different poisons.
So they were already thinking of the replication problem.
Yeah, they're already thinking of it. They're just not, that's just not like getting into the writing yet. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much. I'm going to dash, but thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Nice to see you. Megan.
Hi, Alisha, thank you so much as well. This is really amazing, and I look forward to reading the book. But my question is about you made a connection between anatomical demonstrations, or the use of cadavers in anatomical experiments and demonstrations, and with the use of these prisoners. And I was wondering if there were any similarly mitigating public demonstrations of these, or trials. So if it had happened in public in the same way.
Okay, yeah, well, that's actually a great question and really interesting. So in most cases, actually, these poison trials don't happen in public. They happen in prison, in private. And that's actually described as like that's one reason why several of the prisoners say that they consented to it. It's actually described as part of this like dance of consent that I mean, this appears in Mattioli and Ambroise Paré and a couple other, there's several sources in which almost word for word, they all say the prisoner said he would much rather take poison in prison in private than be hanged in front of everyone. And hanging was viewed as this dishonorable death. A public hanging was viewed as really lowly, dishonorable. In Northern Europe, it could dishonor your whole family. So being given the opportunity to not have that happen was actually, there are reasons why a prisoner might have wanted to do this. So in almost all the cases, it is a small private gathering, although there are a couple, like one of Mattioli's is described as taking place in front of in front of the emperor and assembled nobles. So that case, there clearly were more than just a few people, but then nothing happened. They gave them the poison and the antidote, nothing happened. They like sat around for a while and then got bored and sent him to prison and then gave him another dose. And then like things got going eventually, but the assembled guests got bored. And then this one I described for my fourth chapter on Wendell Tumler, that one was described as a public one. And I think that kind of replicated the public execution, that in this very small town, there was only one other person condemned to death within the like 5-year period around that one trial. So it was very unusual to have a criminal condemned to death, and the other person, it seems like he probably wasn't even executed. So there was like this missing, this anticipation of an execution, I think they had to replace in that case. But that's the only one that was described as having like a much wider gathering. For the most part, they were deliberately not public spectacles.
Great, thank you so much.
Viola, did you have a question? I said no.
I had the same question.
Okay, great.
I guess I was thinking, I am not an early modern scholar. I'm in Italian studies, but not early modern, so I don't know. But I was thinking, was there an animal considered, a non-human animal considered the closest to humans? And you explained why they didn't want to use non-human animals, because it wouldn't work as well, I guess. But if there was such an animal that was considered super close, did they attempt to do that, to use that?
Yeah, so I tried to figure that out. I mean, there's like the Aristotelian idea that has like quadrupeds and birds, and I was trying to, because Galen describes when he describes using roosters, he says it's because they have a drier composition than domesticated birds. So presumably that means they're closer to the human but I think that they're usually using, at this point, they use birds or dogs in tests. And as far as I can tell, it's just about availability, not about trying to replicate being close to humans. So the most common test subjects are birds, but then we start to see, I mean, dogs become the big 17th century animal test subject. And you see, I do have one case in which 8 dogs are used for one very giant poison trial. So yeah, so dogs start to become used as well. But I don't think that's about the galenic makeup at all. I think it's just because they were there and available. Although you did see with the dogs, they did try to like they did 4 poisons on 8 dogs, put them in pairs and tried to match the coloration of the pairs. And they were roughly tried to like replicate the 4 humors. So one was kind of reddish and one was yellowish and one was black. So they were like, you know, I think they were trying to vaguely make the dogs galenic, but it's that they don't say that explicitly, but I have a feeling that was what was going on. Colin.
Oh, great. Excuse me. Thanks so much for the talk, and I look forward to buying the book. My question is about the actual antidotes themselves. Just because you mentioned Mithridatum and Syriac, and there seems to be this rise, you know, around the 2nd century BCE of polypharmacy and these cure-alls that include like 45 or 65 ingredients, and that seems at least sort of to mirror the political power of the growing Roman Empire or something along those lines, where the actual political outreach or the sort of tentacles of the empire can pull together the precise ingredients so as to have a power over the body in this sort of new dramatic fashion. So I'm just curious about whether the antidotes in the 16th century are, you know, replicating that type of mirroring of political circumstances or specific political power. And
yeah, I think they do. Yes, definitely. Like the bezoar, there's several tests on bezoar at Emperor Ferdinand I's court in the early 1560s, and that's long before bezoar really becomes widely disseminated. So, I mean, the Portuguese already have control over Goa and Cochin, and there is like the beginnings of a greater rise in trade of bezoar, but it's before a lot of the famous treatises that include descriptions of bezoar have been published. So there's not this like published information about it, and they're still starting to do these tests. So there's clearly like a lot of, I think it is a symbol of princely power. And these are a lot of times, these are items that would be found in the princely Kunstkammer. So I think it's partially demonstrations on items that were in the, you know, the prince's possessions that were valuable, but not all of them. So that's like, so it's true to a certain extent, but then the other 2 big categories are the princely ones that princes themselves create. So I mentioned this poison powder by Archduke Ferdinand. The Medici family had their own scorpion oil, which is a version of the Caravitas oil that they tested that, you know, it didn't have terribly valuable ingredients. So it was basically made by boiling a bunch of scorpions in oil and distilling it. But yeah, so there were ones that were attached to the prince himself. So there's obviously an element of princely power there as well. There were ones from local alchemists, and then one of the ones that kept coming up again and again was an antidote called terra sigillata, which is a clay. And the original terra sigillata came from a very specific hillside on the island of Lemnos, which by this point was Ottoman. So it was very hard. You know, the Ottomans had started to export it into Europe, but it was difficult. That had a lot of concerns about fraud. So there started to be a bunch of local clays found all over Europe. So Katie Park has written about the Maltese earth. That's one of the first ones. But then there's a German one that showed up a lot in my sources that they're doing. And there's they're like these little medallions stamped with a seal of whatever different place that they came from. So that was about local. So there's also this interest in local drugs. So it was a mix. So some of them were very much about empire, like the bezoar, definitely. But some of them were also about local interests and local cures.
So but they tend to be about individual items that like sort of markets access rather than.
Yeah, I think they're more market access than getting. Yeah, it's not like they don't require necessarily ingredients from all over the empire the same way that they reacted. Yeah, So it's, yes, more about like expanding commercial markets, but then also expanding local markets as well. So both like broad, but also deep. Yeah. Christina.
Hi, Alisha. Thank you for that presentation. And I also have a copy of your book, so thank you for the review. So I have a very kind of general question, maybe ignorant. So I'm moving back to the 16th century, having spent a lot of time in the 18th century, and I work mostly with hospital documents, and I've been looking mostly at the prescriptive ones, and I'm just struck by how they keep emphasizing how all of the medicines that they're going to use, very kind of broad terms, and emphasis on medicines and the centrality of medicines, to define this as a therapeutic space. And I think I've always overlooked it. I've taken it for granted. I've always kind of said, well, early pre-modern medicine is more kind of preventative than curative. And I wondered if you could speak more of that, because, based on my reading, I do know that there's clearly a global market for drugs, but a tendency to kind of dismiss it as luxury goods, the interests of elites. And, I know there's like alchemical interests, but are we perhaps missing that drugs were really central to humoral medicine, to perceptions of medicine's curative effects, what patients wanted? Is there a larger story to be told about the centrality of drugs to early modern medical practice?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, the interesting thing is that for physicians, drugs for a long, in Galenic theory, are supposed to be the kind of least important of the various healing methods. So the most important is diet. So curing by diet is always better than curing through drugs. And one of the 16th century physicians I looked at said, he prefers to cure through the kitchen and the apothecary. So it's like that's the more important. But at the same time, there is this influx of new substances. So there's this general popular interest in drugs that physicians share. So there is overall, drugs become much more something that's written about. So there are almost no standalone treatises about drugs before the 16th century. And then you start to see them popping up in the 16th century, like standalone treatises about one particular drug. So guaiac is a really good example of one that engendered its own standalone treatises. At the same time, the thing that separates physicians from empirical practitioners is their ability to go beyond drugs. So it's always emphasized that this isn't the only method. They have all these other items in their toolbox, diagnosis through diet and blood, prescriptions of bloodletting, and all of the physicians' case studies, like the ones Joanna Pomata have looked at and some other ones that she hasn't, really tend to emphasize that whole panoply of curative methods, not just the drugs. So mine is actually giving maybe more of a sense of drugs, the importance of drugs, than would the many physicians would have really wanted to represent. But you can see that physicians really were interested in claims of success of some of these substances. And a really good example of that is the alchemist who I examined in my last chapter, who came up with this panacea that he named after himself, the panacea Amvaldina. It was an alchemical drug. His claims of success were incredibly dubious, and physicians recognized from the start that this was very dubious. But yet they still wanted a sample of it. Andreas Libavius is one of the main actors in this. They sought after it. They tested it. Even after they decided it was worthless, they were still trying to see if maybe it actually had something. So even though they were really skeptical of the substance, they were still constantly trying to figure out if maybe there was actually something to it after all. So in short, yes, there was a definite greater interest in drugs in the 16th century, but it was very complicated as far as how physicians viewed it.
Thank you.
Dan.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, and I'll ask both of them because I think maybe they might relate to one another, but maybe not. The first one is just, you mentioned different terminology near the beginning of the presentation, experiment, trial, some other terms, and also their lack of precision and ambiguity in the early modern period. But in contemporary times, so for instance, in like the 17th century, trial is often used to mean what we would maybe want to call experiment. Right. But nowadays we use trial for, for drugs and medicines, and in order to determine safety and efficacy.
Yeah.
And we don't use experiment, and we use, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if you have if you see any significance in that. And then, but I suppose my bigger question is, I'm curious what, if anything, you have to say about what this history of this kind of medical experimentation, which notably, as I think you call attention to, is really happening, a century before the sort of age of, 17th century scientific experimentation, but what its relationship is, or what your study's implications are for our idea about the history of non-medical scientific experimentation, which, where most of the story, at least as we tell it, focuses on the 17th century.
Yeah. Well, for both of those questions, I can kind of plug someone else's book, which is Jutta Shikori's About Method, discusses the importance of snake venom in the development of experiment from the 17th century to the 20th century. So she kind of picks up where I leave off in some ways. But she argues that like throughout, from the 17th century onward, that snake venom and was really central to the like methodological developments in the history of experiment. And in terms of the modern terminology, I don't actually know if there is, because I don't know what happened in between as much. So I'm not sure like I'd have to look at the 17th, 18th, 19th century sources to see what happens to this term trial and where it goes. So that I'm not exactly sure, but it's definitely still used. That term trial is one of, in English, certainly the most common term that I saw in the 16th century to refer to this kind of poison trial. So that's actually kind of why I called the book The Poison Trials, because the English language sources refer to them as trials. But what happens in the 17th centuries is the use of human subjects for this test really ends at the end of the 16th century. I haven't found, the last case I found, and it's just a brief mention, it's not a full description, is 1597 in Italy. There may be later ones that I haven't found yet, but that was the last that I saw. And then it goes back to animals, but poison and the interest in using poison for testing is more about toxicology than about antidotes. So the testing really sort of shifts to looking at testing what kind of poison, the effects of poison, the doses of poison, that sort of thing, and that switches to animals. And there's a Swiss physician named Johannes Jakob Wepfer, who is sort of known as the father of toxicology today, who really does extensive studies on toxicology. But he specifically references back to these 16th century poison trials. He's read Mattioli. He completely ignores the fact that Mattioli was involved in these poison trials, but he does mention that Prince's work. So he said, people have criticized me for the horrible things I'm doing to animals, testing poison. But if you look back into the 16th century, they were doing this on humans, and that was terrible. So at least I'm not doing it on humans, I'm doing it on animals. So so there's this, it's used as a foil in later times. And then, Hal Cook has shown how much of the Royal Society were physicians. I mean, there is definitely a medical influence on the 17th century experimentation in general. So so I think so I've seen a few specific references. I think there's some ties. Robert Boyle actually did one experiment with poison. He actually paid someone he was trying to use iron as an antidote to poison, and he actually paid someone to take a poison, and then the guy survived, and apparently went off and did it in a couple other different settings, the same guy. So that kind of test still lasted. And also the practice of getting special licenses for drugs, which became a really common practice in the 17th and 18th century, where apothecaries are supposed to be the only ones to sell drugs, but most regions had a system for special drug licensing. So David Gentlecore has described the charlatan system in Italy, but there were also the Holy Roman Empire had one, France had one. Justin Rivest has worked on the French cases a bit, but that basically for antidotes to poison, they would have them do a public poison trial using animals, where they would give the animals poison and then the antidote, and if it worked, they would get a license for that drug. So I found a couple of those in the archives in Vienna. So that specific kind of test, and the licensing bodies were always boards of physicians. So physicians were still accepting this kind of test as valid evidence for the efficacy of drugs, even in the 17th century. So that kind of experiment, although no longer in humans, lasted a long time into the 18th century. Does that kind of answer your question?
Sure.
Okay. Joan.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. Great ideas about fantastic sources. Continuing on your notion of experimental thinking and in conjunction with Daniel's question, your mention of the 8-dog trial, and your description of the very first trial leads me to ask whether you see any inklings of an attempt to think comparatively, or so to speak, in quotation marks and brackets, controlled experiments.
Yes. I mean, I think that's obviously what's going on here. And for the human, then this is where I think they realize that animals can be more useful than humans. So the dogs, they can use 8 of them and test different poisons, and half of them get the antidote and half of them don't. So they can scale it up in a way that you can't with humans. The only trial I've seen that uses 2 humans, one of whom does not get the antidote, is the one by the Pope. So Pope Clement VII is the only one that does not give an antidote to a human. Although there's a reference to one that Cosimo de' Medici did as well. So that's a possible second one. But Galen's rooster experiment Galen describes this experiment using roosters, a group of which get the antidote and a group of which just get don't get the antidote. So I think they're modeling that on Galen, actually, because they're definitely reading Theriac to Piso. So I think that's kind of the idea. It's just that it doesn't work so well with humans. And then at some point they realize it works well with animals, and Wepfer's experiments in the 17th century do some of that using a group that you might call a control group. But it's not, that's not like, I think the main idea there is to just prove that the poison was poisonous. So you see that replicated in some of the trials where they only use 1 human, where they wait till the poison has obviously taken effect to give the antidote. So they give the prisoner poison, then they wait and they describe what happens really carefully. And once it becomes clear that they're in sort of mortal peril, and sometimes they describe the prisoner as crying out like, "Oh, please help me, or I am sure to die." They have like quotation marks about what the prisoner said in it. And that's when they give the antidote. So the emphasis here is that to show that the antidote works, they have to show that the poison works. So I think that's the main interest.
Thank you.
Well, since we're coming up on 1:30 and there's time if anyone raises their yellow sort of Simpsons hand
Megan, did
for
you have
one more question, but if not.
I had a small question,
Okay, go ahead.
which was about how the antidote was administered during the papal trial, or the trial that Pope did, as anointing,
Yes.
rather than ingested. And I wondered if there was more detail about
Yeah, no, that one's really curious because it's and it's all of the oil. So the Italians have these oils, and all of those appear to be external antidotes, as opposed to internal. And in the initial one, there's like real religious resonance because it's like anoint. You know, there's obviously there's this resonance to holy oil, and it's talked about. And this Caravita was a former monk. I mean, he was not practicing the time. So I mean, I never quite figured what that was all about because it only appears in that one. This mention of anointing only appears in this one case. In the other ones with the oils, they don't describe exactly how it was given. They just say that they took it. But no, I think that's really interesting, and I think there's some kind of I never quite figured out what exactly was going on there. All the other ones they ingest the poison. So I mean the antidotes. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we can all thank Alisha for a great presentation. I think a really great discussion. Congratulations on.
Thank you. Thanks so much for all of your questions, and it was really great to talk to you all.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.